If you aren't familiar with AWESOME, it stands for Achieving Women's Excellence in Supply Chain Operations, Management, and Education. AWESOME is the supply chain's most prominent and active organization focused on advancing women's supply chain leadership. Involving senior executives in a wide range of supply chain roles, AWESOME provides opportunities for networking, collaboration, and development. Our next panel of senior leaders are from Boeing, Sims Metal Management, and Johnson & Johnson. And they're going to focus on the interaction between people and technology and the importance of leveraging and building connections in the supply chain to ensure future competitiveness. The panel will be moderated by Heather Sheehan, who is the Director of Membership Engagement and Sponsorships at AWESOME. She is also the former VP and Co-Chief Procurement Officer for the Danaher Corporation. So without any further ado, please welcome to the stage Heather Sheehan, Norma Clayton, Felicia Dinkle, and Mary Stevens.
I wanted to thank Kim, but I also want to thank one more person who's in the audience somewhere. But John Fitzgerald of GT Nexus was really instrumental in bringing AWESOME to the Bridges Conference. So John, thank you very much for having us here. So let me start by giving you a little bit more information about our panelists. Mary Stevens is Vice President of Strategy and Development in Supply Chain for Johnson & Johnson. Mary has put her engineering background to good use, holding top supply chain and operations roles at Newell Rubbermaid and Tyco prior to J&J. And she also held earlier positions with General Electric, Bertelsmann Inc., and Knoll Inc. So welcome, Mary. Norma Clayton. She just retired a few weeks ago from Boeing, where she was Vice President of Learning, Training, and Development. She comes from a very strong supply chain background herself. She led Boeing's global sourcing, supplier management, and procurement, as well as their maintenance and modification centers. And prior to Boeing, she held leadership and operations positions at McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed Martin, General Electric, RCA, and General Motors. So welcome, Norma. And Felicia Puma Dinkle is Vice President Global Logistics with Sims Metal Management. She joined them last November. Sims, if you don't know them, is the world's leading publicly listed metals, electronics, and municipal recycling company. They have about a $5 billion revenue and 100 years serving the global marketplace. Prior to Sims, Felicia held leadership positions with Honeywell, Maersk, and Sealand. So welcome, Felicia. And to all of you.
Thanks, Heather.
So a lot of experience on this panel, and they're going to share their experience about supply chain technology and what it means and how to leverage it, as Kim mentioned. So I want to start with Mary. So Mary, why is supply chain technology important in J&J's supply chain? What are some of the areas that where you've leveraged technology and supply chain, especially in order to collaborate both with internal and external partners?
So thank you, Heather. So I always love it when I follow a panel that sets the stage so beautifully. When you start to talk about data in supply chain, data transparency is absolutely the search for the Holy Grail. We are all looking to have data transparency. And so when we think about our technology strategy, so much of it is tied to this, get every bit of data. When I think about Johnson & Johnson, it's hugely complicated. $75 billion in revenue, 350,000 SKUs, hundreds of distribution centers, over 100 of manufacturing sites, hundreds of suppliers, thousands of raw material suppliers. Being able to connect these suppliers is hugely complicated. And so when I joined, one of the things that was happening is that we had been on a multi-year journey, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, to implement one ERP platform. And that was going to be our answer to the search for data. But as most of us know, that is not today's answer. Data doesn't only exist inside our supply chain, data exists everywhere. And in J&J, although we have 70 some odd ERP systems, we have hundreds of other applications that have data both inside and outside, and our shippers are among them. And so how do we connect that data strategy together is part of the element of our technology strategy. And so we've really blown up our one ERP strategy and are now focusing on the needs of the business. And so we're really going needs of the business, data science and analytics, our data lake and data grid strategy, and then connecting to platforms in every variety, both inside and outside J&J, in order to be able to drive the business needs. This has unlocked enormous potential because it allows everyone to go faster and really changes the game for us in that search for being able to see every bit of data that really drives performance.
That's great. Norma, I want to ask you the same question about technology at Boeing in Boeing's supply chain and where you've used it to collaborate.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a very similar experience as J&J. We've grown up as a corporation through mergers and acquisitions, 7 within the last 15 years. Boeing today is located in 142 different locations around the world and in 42 countries. The company is 100 years old. As of July 15th of last year. Like J&J, we have an extremely complex supply chain, and the challenge that we have is it's heavily regulated also by the U.S. government and governments around the world. We're a $98 billion business, and as a result of all the mergers and acquisitions that we've done, we've had to go to a centralized system, and that has not been easy. It's not been easy inside of the company, and it hasn't been easy for some of our partners because they don't have the same level of talent that Boeing has in terms of being able to manage its supply chain, and they also don't have the rigor around the data analytics. So it's been quite challenging, but I agree with Mary's comment about the search for data. That's really where we all find ourselves. I'm sure you're dealing with similar things in your company, and that's what we're all going to have to deal with going forward.
Right. And what about your experience with technology in the supply chain and collaboration, Felicia?
Well, Heather, thanks. It has been a real journey, both in my prior life, in a manufacturing company, and now when I am with a major recycling company. And many times, people think, oh, recycling, what does that have to do? You're not manufacturing anything, but we need to have the data to be able to see the flows, of the recycled materials that are coming in. And it's kind of funny because everything was really done manually, and I was really brought in to try and get processes and better technology to be able to leverage then internally, some of our supply chain, to be able to leverage our procurement, our sourcing, to be able to leverage what we're doing with our carriers. We use every mode under the sun, okay? And so to us, technology is so important to be able to get all of that data together to be able to better leverage what we're trying to do to grow this company.
Great. Well, do you want to add on, Norma?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about how we're using it, to collaborate. As I said, we're located around the world, and so being able to have really good, robust conversations is critical. We're in different time zones, so when you get on these calls, you have upwards of 20 or 30 different people all through the various levels of your supply chain. So we have lots of collaboration tools and virtual environments that we can use to have very robust conversations in order to help us make better decisions. So if you're really, down that path of trying to make very good informed decisions, getting your data as clean as possible and getting it in a way that is easily digestible and curated is going to be very important.
Well, let me continue on that thought and ask you this question about supply chain technology and where it's provided the biggest ROI. Where have you seen the most success from supply chain technologies?
A very good question. We've seen a lot of it on the indirect spend side. we had a lot of overhead costs in that area. And so using things such as reverse auctions have provided us with lots of opportunities to reduce costs. Master agreements have allowed us to do that, pushing things down to the lowest level of authority so that we can get faster decision making, and being able to work with our partners in terms of how they're structuring their supply chains has been really helpful in terms of getting us the ROI that we expect and then the value add. When you think about a company as complex as Boeing, $98 billion in revenue, 70 cents on every dollar goes back into our supply chain. So that's pretty substantial. Anything that we do on both direct and indirect spend directly falls to not only our bottom line, but to that of our partners as well.
Well, Mary, let me turn to you and ask the same question about where you had the best ROI on some of your supply chain technologies at J&J.
Yeah, so when we think about technology, it floats in two different areas. First, in the production of our product. We think about how we're investing for the future and where technology is really bringing us to the next level. So the first thing is to think about additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing, has been around for 30 years. I remember studying it in school. But what's really changed in the last couple of years is you used to be able to 3D print something, and if you held it in your hand and closed your fingers together, all you had was dust. But what's shifted dramatically in the last 5 years is the material and advanced material sciences that allow us to print anything. We can print cells, we can print bone, we can print metals, we can print titanium, we can print aluminum, we can print resins, we can print anything. And it has the same material characteristics as molding or extruding or other manufacturing. This changes the game for us dramatically. It allows, and the cost of 3D printers is a fraction of traditional equipment. So this really changes the way we work. And it starts by thinking about it in terms of alternate forms of manufacturing. Well, if I'm only putting down the material I need, and I don't have to machine it away, and I don't have to lose it in scrap, and I don't have to have tooling, and I don't have to have anything, the cost of producing is dramatic. But it also changes the cycle time. It changes the forms of what I can produce. So from an R&D perspective, it changes how products are produced. And lastly, it changes how I can produce. Many of us can go into a fast food restaurant now and see a Coke machine. Coke machines allow you to personalize your beverage to whatever flavoring you might like. Well, think of medicine that way. Right now, today in the market, if you have a cranial problem, I can 3D print a part of your skull to replace it, personalized to you. I can make facial cutting guides, I can make facial knees, and I can connect those to embedded sensors in 3D printed items to track performance of whether or not you're following your medication, whether or not you're following your exercise routine. Think about the shift just by changes in technology and what that's done. And so if you think about production, that's one area of change. And so we have things like automation. Another area is how we manage our assets. Here we're looking at things like augmented reality. Augmented reality allows me to change how I'm maintaining equipment. So first of all, I have predictive maintenance, where we're partnering with many companies to understand what the machine is telling us. Is it going to fail? How do we think about it? How do we work on it? We use data and science to do that. But then we're using augmented technology for the person running the machine, because then my technician doesn't have to be next to the machine in order to be able to be seeing the same thing as the operator when the machine goes down. The change and changeovers, repairs, change of work really changes the dynamic. And then and those ROIs are off the charts. We haven't even begun to understand the ramifications, but the speed of deployment is huge because the adoption rate is incredibly inexpensive, and people really like it. It's kind of cool. You can look through your goggles, everybody can see the same thing, and the ease of use is incredible. I mean, I could train someone in less than an hour on the use of the tool, and then if they have a question about operating, training, maintenance, anything else, we can change it. And so the ROI of these new technologies coming on board is dramatic, and we have just begun to explore the opportunity they unlock.
Well, Felicia, let me ask you about where have you seen the best returns on supply chain technology?
Some of the best returns were what Norma mentioned before, which was in indirect procurement. And the second one was really in logistics, in basically taking a look at the better way to leverage, using a reverse auction in order to, manage our spend in transportation, but also to utilize the technology to be able to see our fleets, private fleets, and to be able to understand when the maintenance has to be done, when we have to, in fact, we have a lot of drivers out there that we need to make sure that they were up to speed and all the compliance and all the regulations that are out there with regards to transportation. So having the technology to be able to maintain and manage and to be able to see and give information before we have a problem, a regulation problem, is really key and has returned the most for us.
Well, let me continue with you and ask you the flip side of that question,
Okay.
and that is, where have you seen some of the biggest failures, and why were they failures?
Oh, okay. So there have been failures, and it really was based on getting the best technology. And when I say it, it's not only getting the best technology, it's really implementing the best technology and how that implementation goes through. So you have teams who are out there, they identify a problem, they come back to you and they tell you, this is the technology we think that's important. If they come back and they do not align with all the various functions with your finance, with your leadership, with IT, that's where it can go awry. So you have people who know how to solve a problem. You've got this technology team outside who's willing to work, and if the business people are not aligned internally, no matter what that external system is trying to, or the team is trying to do to help you, it's not going to happen. And what happens internally is that you have this frustration because the resources aren't there. They get put on other projects because they don't see this project working out for them. The frustration, the time, the money, and the planning all goes awry.
Norma, what about you? Have you seen any failures?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've seen many. And I agree with everything that you just said. Getting those stakeholders involved is critical. But in our business, it goes beyond that because we have field operations. And so if the field personnel are not involved, particularly in the logistics side of it with spare parts and things of that nature, you can have total chaos. But more importantly, when you think about what I said earlier about Boeing's spend in terms of 70% of every revenue dollar going back into the supply chain, when you think about that, any failure within the supply chain itself can be catastrophic. And that was one of the problems that we experienced early on as we were trying to bring a new airplane to market. Some of the suppliers that we had relied on for many, many years, who are very good suppliers, did not really understand the demand patterns that would be coming at them with a high volume of airplanes that they would be building and a different airplane structure. They were used to building a metallic airplane. Well, we went to a composite airplane for the very reasons that Mary talked about earlier in terms of additive manufacturing and reducing the costs in the production cycle. And so they were not ready to deal with the volume of parts and systems and subsystems that they would have to deliver. And so at one point we had a breakdown in our supply chain which caused a lot of dissatisfaction from our customers, and I'm sure you all read about that with the constant delays on the Dreamliner. But fortunately, we have recovered from that and we're starting to get those airplanes through the cycle. But it's critical that when you have a supply chain that has been with you for a long time, you may be innovating internally, but you've got to make sure that your partners are innovating as well. And as they're doing acquisitions and they're spinning off pieces of their business and creating new supply chains, you've got to make sure from a systems perspective that they're compatible. So bringing all these stakeholders to the table is really critical.
Mary, any failures you want to talk about and share any cautionary tales?
I think anybody over the age of 16 has had at least one tech failure in their life. But anyway, I do want to say just one thing. I think that, something to think about is that it starts with the strategy. Does your change that you want to make follow the strategy that your business is living into? Because any deployment of technology is going to require a lot of heavy lifting. And the likelihood that some portion of that technology implementation is going to go wrong is high. Most of us, our data is not as clean as we want it to be. Our people aren't as well trained as they want to be. They think they understand things, and then when it goes together, it doesn't work. You uncover compatibility issues when you deploy them. So unless you're operating in a complete and total vacuum, when you turn your piece of equipment on, something's going to go wrong. And whether you're Apple and you're releasing the latest version of the iPhone and you're having to release patch after patch to find the things that go wrong, or you're a small business located on a desert island, if you're connected to somebody else, the probability of that happening is high. But if you have leadership alignment, I think that's something Felicia said, if you have leadership alignment and everyone is bought into this as a critical enabler to the strategy, then when those things go wrong and everybody understands that there's going to be disruption, they stand behind the change. Because if they don't stand behind the change and you back off of it, that's 10 times worse than the failure that you lived through. Because what happens then is that the next time you go to implement anything, the skeptics will stand behind the lines, they won't engage early, they won't live into it, they won't lean into it, and it'll be 5 times harder to regenerate after the initial failure gets cut off because people lose faith. And so, the critical item that I've learned over the years is get the critical stakeholders, especially the naysayers, especially the people who don't believe, in line and in the box up front. Because every day that they're standing on the sidelines and watching is a day that your system failure is going to show up as one of their highlights to their boss, that that they weren't part of the solution going forward. So just a critical enabler for success.
Yeah, I just want to capitalize on your comment, Mary, about the naysayers. Believe it or not, you can turn them into some of your biggest advocates, and they're going to give you the feedback that you probably are too afraid to hear. Right? So bring them in. They bring a wealth of information. Sometimes they can be difficult, but you got to understand what the intent is. Where is their head set? And in most cases, my experience has been they really want to help. So you have to provide them that opportunity to come in and help you, because you'll find at the end of the day, when they tell you that they're happy with it, they really are happy with it. They're not telling you what you want to hear. And when they are dissatisfied, you're going to know why, and they're going to stay with you and help you try to fix it.
Well, Norma, let me continue with you. You've had some experience with mergers and acquisitions, which can also be challenging and pretty difficult. What have you seen that works and doesn't work as it relates to technologies in the supply chain when you're working on an acquisition integration?
Yeah, I've been involved in a lot of them, both leading some of these and also being part of them in terms of moving from one company to a new company. And the biggest challenge that I see goes exactly back to what Felicia talked about earlier, is not getting all the right stakeholders involved when it comes to the technology decisions that need to happen. My experience coming through industry in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a lot of M&A activity going on, is that the value proposition wasn't well thought out in terms of what you really wanted to get out of that acquisition. And so things like back-end systems, culture change, those things were kind of left off the table. And they were typically run by your finance organization, your HR organization. So all of the other functions that are critical to helping you figure out what your system strategy should be aligned with the business strategy were absent from the table. And so as a result, what typically would happen is the acquisition would occur and then the battle began. The battle around whose system was going to stay and whose system was going to go. I'm sure that may resonate with some of you. So it really became a competition of the legacy system owners, and in many cases, the right business decisions were not being made. Albeit there are times when you really want to fully integrate all of those systems into the new parent company, and then there are times when you don't want to do that. And so having a really good, well thought out business strategy and bringing the right stakeholders to the table will enable you to make the right business decisions. So I've seen many situations where it has not gone well. And the biggest loser in this is the end user. Their experience changes, particularly if they're coming from a company where they had a very good experience, and now you're integrating them into a new company where the experience may not be as good. And that also affects all the suppliers that have to come along with that. So it's better sometimes to slow down before you speed up and get all the right parties involved so that you can have a successful acquisition as well as get the value out that you expected in terms of an ROI.
Felicia, I see you nodding over there. I'm going to ask if you've got anything to add.
Oh, I've had acquisitions in the past life, and I've been part of acquisitions. And it is definitely imperative that there is alignment, that there is, the stakeholders, they're talking, and the culture that you talked about, Norma, that is so true. So many times, corporations will go out there and you know that there's a strategy and why are you acquiring this company? There's a reason for it. But it's not always, pushed down to the lowest level. Sometimes it just stays up here high, and that's where the culture is, it's lacking. People down below, well, why did they even buy us in the first place? They're making such changes. And the other problem is, with the technology, if you don't have access to your data to be able to implement a system or two, maybe that you see as being advantageous to the company that you're acquiring, if you don't understand it and you don't have people giving you, the rationale as to why was that system implemented, how would it benefit you now, it's going to be it'll be a very negative implementation for the acquired company.
Mary, I'll certainly let you have an opportunity to answer about acquisitions, but I also have another question for you. Any comments about acquisition, or go to the next one?
I think we can go on.
Okay.
I think they covered it well.
Okay. What's the role of J&J's IT function in supply chain technology decisions and implementations? And are there some challenges that you can continue to try to work through to make the supply chain and IT functions work better at J&J?
Yeah, so thank you. So first of all, I would say that our IT CIO is my best friend. And I think at the moment, I think I might be his too. He tells me that when he comes over to what we're working on, it's kind of the best part of his day. And what got us to that point, because I would say we didn't always start out that way, was really trying to understand, what our roles were in driving the technology evolution of what we wanted to do. And I think getting that clarity up front really helped. And so now where we are is our IT team absolutely is responsible for the plumbing. They decide which technology, what the stack needs to be, how it needs to be connected, how it needs to be secured, and we're slowly getting our business leaders to stop chasing shiny objects. They all go to conferences, and they see the latest, oh, look, there it is, I want it, because it's going to solve my problems. That is not true. And as much as it might sound good, and there's promises made, when those promises come in-house, that fragmentation of approach creates havoc in our system. And so within J&J, in the supply chain organization, we had hundreds of different projects going on, all of which were sub-optimized, many times sequenced in a way that where they were crashing into each other. And so we were spending more money deploying and then going back and redeploying, and then deploying and going back and redeploying, because we didn't realize that there was an appropriate sequence for the work that we were doing to really try and solve the problem. And so we would go and we would spend tons and tons of money to connect to a system that somebody else would then come and take out because it was on their roadmap to take that system out. And then we would have to build the new connection to the new system to go forward. And in the meantime, there was nothing but disruption and nobody was happy. Now, with that absolute crystal clear clarity, supply chain defines the problems we are trying to solve. We have begun to staff with some really, really cool people, some data science functionality, and you don't need a lot. I mean, for the entire of J&J supply chain, we have like a dozen of these guys. They are brilliant. They have operations research backgrounds. They can use machine learning. They can create algorithms. They can do magical things. And, you put these people in a room and all kinds of cool stuff comes out, even stuff you didn't even imagine. And the key is then to spend the money to have the people who are just doing nothing more than getting the data and cleaning the data, so that your data science team isn't spending their time trying to find it. So, we've been able to invest. And so now, the clear delineation really makes a difference. The IT team builds the architecture, the stacks, the data grids in order to be able to capture the data. The supply chain team figures out what's important, prioritizes, focuses on the business problems, drives the different business practices, policies, procedures, data management, data cleansing, and then we're the beneficiaries by being able to use the data science to glean the insights. And that role clarity has changed the game for us in how we operate with IT, because before that, they were trying to do process stuff, they were chasing shiny objects, we were chasing shiny objects, and everybody was deploying. And now the speed of change is dramatic.
That's great. What about that kind of clarity at Boeing between supply chain and IT?
Yeah, it's pretty much exactly what Mary just described, with maybe one little nuance, and maybe you all are doing this. We took the budgets away also from the other functions so that they can't go out and buy all the new shiny objects, right? So there's now a procurement council that IT and supply chain shares. So when you have a new shiny object, we want you to bring it to that council and let's see how it fits with the overall architecture and the overall business cases that the supply chain is working on to make sure that it's really going to provide some value back to the business. And if it's not going to get funded.
Felicia, you might have a different situation given what you said at the beginning about your role at Sims, where you've been brought in to really create some infrastructure and decision-making processes for supply chain. What are you seeing in terms of the supply chain and IT functions working together at Sims?
The CIO sits right next door to me, and he hears me and I hear him. And we work together because he really does see value. He came from a larger organization, and really sees the value in having the technology for the supply chain. He gets it that we need the data visibility. He gets it that the processes, that Sims has been utilizing in the past need to be really upgraded. And we work very, very, very diligently together. They are looking at our issue, is Sims is a company that was all various little companies around the United States, Australia, and Europe and UK, all put together, but the systems really weren't put together well. And so he's working on some changes from an ERP perspective, but he recognizes, and he keeps saying to me, it's really the supply chain, and I'm going to get my best ROI by getting you happy and getting you the data to be able to make the better decisions. So being his neighbor is very important.
That's great. Great.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that I think is really important. So, when our business leaders go out and see things, we encourage them to bring them back. Right. So we never want to discourage anyone from going out and looking at the shiny objects and seeing them, because we might miss something. And that's so important to our being able to digest new ideas and new technologies and new breakthroughs. So we never want to stop anyone from the explore part. What we stopped was the don't start it in-house until we get a chance to take a look.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to turn to Norma because you have probably a unique perspective, given your most recent role at Boeing, where you were in charge of the training, learning, and development after a long supply chain career before that. How do you see technology being used for people development, especially with supply chain people?
I want to go back to what Mary described earlier. I thought she did a very eloquent job of talking about additive manufacturing and the nuances of that and how quickly things like 3D printing is really changing the way that we work. And then earlier today in one of the general sessions, we were talking about how learning is changing, how rapidly learning is changing how we work. Well, if you think about those two things in context, technology is playing a huge role on people because none of the things that Mary talked about earlier can be done without people. So how we develop supply chain professionals in the future is going to be critical. At Boeing, the supply chain organization is very quickly becoming a strategic lever for the corporation. And so we've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years developing new ways of developing supply chain professionals. They have two real skill needs. There's the professional development need, and then there's the technical skill need. And if you think about how people grew up in the procurement function over the last 20 to 30 years, there was a very structured way that they came through that organization. But there wasn't a whole lot of development going on because the work was very transactional. Well, now the work is very strategic and it's very data dependent. So now they have to use both the right and left side of the brain. It's now an art and a science, and we talked about that earlier today. So we have had to take a very different approach to how we develop supply chain professionals. Number one, they have to come in through the business. They have to spend some time being in operational roles, being in functional roles, being in strategic roles. They also have to be very adept at working with data and doing case analysis. We partnered with Harvard Publishing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Harvard Publishing. They are a subsidiary of the Harvard Business Review. And they have a product that is absolutely fantastic. I encourage you to go and take a look at this product. But it has a way of developing the maturity of not only supply chain professionals, but all functional professionals through a very structured set of learning objects. There's content, there's problem solving, there's negotiation skills, there are professional development skills, and through these different scenarios, the supply chain professional learns how to solve problems, how to ask for help. They learn through very purposeful mistake making so that they can see where they're making mistakes and they can learn from those. And then they are also equipped with different types of technologies that they have to work through within these business cases. They are working with students that are at Harvard in the graduate school, as well as there are opportunities for them to learn from each other within their own organizations. So we have found that to be a very purposeful tool. It's all real time. The data is uploaded and it's changed as frequently as you need it to be so that you can develop very strong supply chain professionals. I believe that supplier management is probably one of the areas where we haven't spent a lot of money really investing in the right tools, but there are a lot of really good portal-based products out there that you can use to help develop your supply chain professionals. They also work on the business conversations, business language, to really make sure that when they're interfacing with business leaders, they're well equipped beyond just understanding the art of the deal, but really understanding how the work they do is going to impact the business, both top line and bottom line.
That's great. Another type of learning comes from benchmarking. And I want to ask Felicia a question about that. What have you learned from benchmarking on technology at companies outside of your own industries? And then how have you applied those lessons to inside your own company?
Well, I can give a good example, Heather. I've done it in the past and continue to do so, because I think you really get to learn what the technology is all about by benchmarking and finding out how it was implemented in a certain company. And a few years back, I did benchmark against a major conglomerate, and I went and met with them and kind of saw how they were using. And what I was looking at was really an auction, a reverse auction type of technology that was starting to be implemented at the time when I was with Honeywell. But then what happened is it sort of stalled. And in order to implement it for some logistics, benchmarked, found that there were clever ways that it was being done, went back and brought with me a senior leader who was skeptical about the technology and utilizing it, in the supply chain. Brought him down, had him meet with leadership at this company, and he all of a sudden changed his mind. And so what ended up happening was we came back, and sure enough, with his backing, full force, we went ahead and implemented the auction that we wanted to do on logistics.
I know a little bit about that because
Yes, you do.
it was the company I was at.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yeah.
So great example, Felicia.
Okay.
Good. That's excellent. Mary, Norma, any examples of
Can I weigh on
benchmarking?
that?
Yeah.
I really, I always feel like there's somebody who's better than I am at something. And so what we have done a lot of lately is try to figure out what our unmet needs are. And then we don't care. We look everywhere until we find the people who are at the cutting edge of capability in that space. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be someone in healthcare. It doesn't need to be someone who's a big organization. It doesn't need to be a competitor. It doesn't need to be anybody in our country. It can be a startup. We have benchmarked tiny 3-person startup operations to see culturally how they're driving innovation, how they're driving something different. And so what we're doing is we are benchmarking based on who we feel is the best in that one particular skill. And what's been interesting about it is that when we find those people who are good at that one particular skill, they typically see something in us that we're particularly good at. And so it becomes the most amazing discussion because we'll be good at something, they'll be good at something completely different. And so the ability to kind of go into the benchmarking session and not have it be a one-way training session is unbelievable, because that enables both companies to learn, especially if we're out of industry. We learn almost more from them. So I'll give you an example. Our biggest quality learnings right now are coming from the electronics industry, which seems shocking. Unregulated, completely open, high-tech, very differentiated. But from a quality perspective, because of the cost pressure in electronics, it far exceeds anything anyone is doing in healthcare. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of our benchmarking in quality is actually coming from the electronics industry, which is odd. And then they're looking at us because many electronics, because of the pressure on security, are becoming more heavily regulated. We have a massive organization and understanding of regulation, and so it becomes just an unbelievable synergy to be able to put the smart people in a room together and learn from each other in a new and differentiated way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Boeing has done the same thing, and some of our greatest learning right now, the example I just gave you, came out of the gaming industry. And it's just perfect when you think about learning. So we are benchmarking the gaming industry, the petrochemical industry, because in our business, safety is paramount. So we have spent a lot of time with BP and Shell. BP, obviously, because of a lot of their lessons learned. Shell, because they're best in class at what they do. And then the automotive industry, because they have been very preeminent in working with alternate materials, hybrid materials, electric materials. So we have learned a lot from those three industries. And then finally, the banking industry. around our data accuracy, data security. So like Mary was saying, we're looking for it in all the non-traditional places other than just within our own space within aerospace.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. We could spend a lot more time talking about these topics, and I think we did in some of our prep calls. But we'll need to wrap things up here. So let me start with Felicia, and just give what kind of a summary comment or emphasis would you give to the messages here that you'd like this audience to hear?
Alignment. Really align all of the functions internally when you're going to implement a technology. Make sure that everyone is involved and that you're able to then facilitate a really excellent execution by having all the parties involved in not only in the decision but in the execution.
That's great. Alignment. Norma?
I think strategy, making sure that all of your supply chain strategies align not only with your business strategy, but with your IT strategy. And then making sure that you involve all the right stakeholders so that you can have very successful integrations and also get the ROI that you're expecting.
Right. Mary?
I think you have to know what are the unmet needs in your business and really have good definition for those, and then look for technology solutions that solve for those unmet needs. Otherwise, you spend a lot of time implementing technology solutions looking for a problem, and that becomes a very unsustainable methodology for improvement.
I think these are all really great lessons, and I especially like the summaries that you've given. I've really enjoyed this conversation. So help me thank these women, these very inspiring leaders from the Awesome Network for sharing their time and their insights today. Thank you very much.